Ella stood at the base of Mount Greywood, staring up at its towering peak, which seemed to pierce the sky like a jagged sword. The wind was cold, the air thin, and the path ahead looked daunting, as though the mountain had never been climbed by anyone before. But Ella had made the decision. This was the year she would conquer it. Her story wasn't one of natural athleticism or a history of mountaineering. In fact, until recently, Ella had never even hiked more than a few miles at a time. But there was something about this mountain. Something about the challenge. Maybe it was the way its snow-capped summit glistened in the morning sun. Or the way it seemed to beckon her forward. Or perhaps it was the fact that she had spent the last 3 years of her life in a battle she had almost lost with self-doubt and insecurity. Ella wasn't always like this, though. She had once been a star student, an athlete, someone with clear goals. But after a series of personal setbacks, failure in her job, the end of a long relationship, and the death of a close friend, she found herself lost, questioning whether her dreams and ambitions were even worth pursuing anymore. She had let the weight of disappointment erode her sense of self-worth. Until one day, she realized she had become a stranger to herself. Standing before the mountain, Ella had no illusions. She knew the climb would be grueling, both physically and emotionally. But she also understood that this mountain represented more than just a physical challenge. It was a metaphor for everything she had been avoiding in her own life. Every step she took on the mountain would be a step she needed to take toward reclaiming the parts of herself she had buried in the past. So, despite the voices in her head that told her she wasn't strong enough, that she wasn't prepared enough, she laced up her boots, tightened the straps on her backpack, and started up the trail. The initial climb was steep but manageable. Ella had spent the past few months preparing, training on smaller hills, learning about proper gear, and pushing herself physically to build strength. She was ready, or at least, she told herself she was. For the first few hours, the air was crisp, the scenery beautiful, birds flew overhead, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. Ella felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if the mountain was welcoming her, reminding her that, despite the struggles she had faced, there was still beauty in the world, still moments of calm to be found in the chaos. But as the hours wore on, the trail grew steeper, the lush forest gave way to jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. Ella's legs began to burn. Her breath came in shorter bursts, and the weight of her backpack felt heavier with every step. She took a moment to rest, sitting on a large boulder. Her mind wandered. Maybe this was too much. Maybe she wasn't cut out for this after all. What was she thinking? A voice deep inside her stirred. A quiet whisper that reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. The strength she had always carried within her. When she had been knocked down before, she had gotten back up. When she had faced heartbreak, she had found ways to heal. This wasn't just a mountain she was climbing. It was a reclamation of her own will. Just one more step, Ella muttered to herself. Then took a deep breath and pushed on. By the time Ella reached the halfway point, the weather had started to turn. The sun disappeared behind heavy clouds, and the wind picked up, swirling around her like an invisible force. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and tightened the straps on her pack. It was in this moment that the mountain seemed to take on a life of its own. The storm intensified, the path became slippery, and the once friendly terrain now looked treacherous. Every step forward felt like a battle, as though the mountain itself was trying to force her back. Ella hesitated. There was no shame in turning around. Was there? She could come back next year. When conditions were better, she could try again when she was stronger. But then, she remembered a conversation she had had with her father years ago. When she was struggling with something in her life, he had told her, when things get hard, Ella, that's when you find out who you really are. You don't quit just because it's tough. You push through, not because the mountain is easy, but because you're stronger than the fear that tries to hold you back. Ella could almost hear his voice now, like a quiet echo of encouragement, guiding her forward. The wind howled louder, and the rain began to fall in torrents. But Ella's resolve had hardened. She was going to finish this climb. With her head down against the wind, she pressed on. The cold stung, the rain soaked through her clothes. But she kept moving, step by step. She reminded herself that it wasn't the storm that defined her. It was her ability to face it. The next few hours were a blur. The storm showed no sign of abating, and Ella's body was starting to rebel. Her legs felt like lead. Her arms ached, and every breath seemed to pull more oxygen than she had to give. It was as though the mountain was testing her, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. She wanted to quit. More than once, the thought crossed her mind. I'm not going to make it. The summit seemed so far away, and the trail was only getting harder. But then, she remembered something else, a moment of vulnerability she had experienced a few months earlier. Ella had gone to therapy, seeking help to work through the grief and loss that had haunted her. During one of the sessions, her therapist had said, "The hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. When you feel like giving up, that's when you have to dig deeper. Your strength isn't just about what you can do physically. It's about how you overcome what holds you back inside." Ella closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to connect with that sense of inner strength. She wasn't climbing the mountain just for the summit. She was climbing it to prove to herself that she could overcome the doubts, the fears, and the pain that had held her back for so long. One more step, just one more. Hours later, the storm finally began to subside. The clouds parted, and the wind died down. The rain turned to a light drizzle, and the sun peeked through, casting golden light over the snow-covered peaks ahead. Ella was exhausted. Her body screamed for rest. But there was a sense of peace that had settled over her. She had made it through the hardest part. She wasn't at the summit yet. But she knew now that the real challenge was never about the mountain. It was about what she was willing to endure to reach the top. As the weather cleared, Ella found herself at a plateau, where the path flattened out for a moment. She paused to catch her breath and take in the view. The landscape stretched out before her, majestic and awe-inspiring. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about the peak anymore. It wasn't even about the climb. It was about the person she was becoming in the process. And then, the summit came into view, closer than it had ever been. The last leg of the climb was the hardest. Every step felt like a test of will. But with each inch forward, Ella felt her resolve strengthen. This was the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had overcome. It wasn't just the mountain she was conquering. It was herself. When she finally reached the summit, Ella stood still for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the moment. The view was beyond anything she could have imagined. The sprawling wilderness, the endless sky, and the silence that enveloped her. It was as if the entire world had opened up before her. And in that silence, Ella realized something profound. The mountain had never been the enemy. It was merely the reflection of the struggle inside her, the one she had fought for so long. She had climbed not just to reach the top, but to prove that no matter the obstacles, she could rise above them. As the wind gently brushed against her face, Ella closed her eyes and smiled. She had made it. The climb was hard. The journey was long. But she had found her way. One step at a time. Ella descended the mountain slowly, taking each step with care. But a new sense of lightness in her heart. The storm had passed, and the path ahead was clear. The summit was no longer just a place on a map. It was a symbol of everything she had learned and everything she had become. She knew the world would still present challenges, still test her strength, but now, she carried with her a deeper understanding of herself. The mountain had taught her the most important lesson of all. That the strength to face any challenge lies not in avoiding hardship, but in the courage to continue, no matter how hard the climb may seem. And with that courage, Ella knew she could face whatever came next, knowing that the summit of tomorrow was always within reach.